All right, in chapter 15, we're going to talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And this is the main model that we're going to use to analyze macroeconomics. Okay? And it's not that difficult because you've already acquired basic concepts of demand and supply. Okay? But there are a few things that we need to talk about this in this chapter. Okay? All right. First of all, I was going to cover the section 15.4, which is about dynamic model, right? But I decided to drop it in this course. It's an introductory course anyway, okay? So I don't think it is necessary to talk about a little more complicated model, right? So we're going to cover only these three sections, okay? 15.1 to 3, right, in this chapter. Okay? Keep that in mind when you go through that My Econ Lab and doing the preparation. Okay, so aggregate demand is it's just the same thing as total demand, right? So instead of talking about the demand for any single particular item, we are talking about the overall demand for everything produced in an economy. Okay? We use the PQ space to discuss demand and supply. Okay? But this time, the demand. This was the demand for a particular good or service, like what? Movies, or demand for smartphones or whatever. Right? Right? And here in macroeconomics, we're talking about the aggregate demand or overall demand. Okay? And so instead of quantity, we're going to use Y, okay? And Y stands for output, GDP, income, right? And in this chapter, aggregate demand, total demand. Okay, so we're gonna write. Typically we write Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus net export. Okay, and this Y we can replace it with AD, aggregate demand. Okay, so aggregate demand is the summation of the demand for consumption, which is the demand from the households demanding consumption goods and services, right? The demand for investment, demand for government purchase, and demand of the foreigners, basically, right? On the exports, right? So net export is export minus import, right? That's the idea, right? All right. So then the price here, this is not the price of any single particular item, but this is just the overall price level. Okay? And make sure you understand. So you can consider it as a sort of the average price, so to speak, right? So on average, what happens to the price of everything in the economy, right? Sometimes there is an overall increase or general increase in the price level, right? We call that inflation, right? So make sure you understand that the concept of price level and the total output or total demand for goods and services. Okay? Now, the next thing we have to understand is the slope, right? Just like the demand and supply we talked about in microeconomics, right? Demand curve, AD is downward sloping, and the aggregate supply, okay, instead of simple aggregate supply, you notice that we use SRAS. That stands for short run aggregate supply. As far as aggregate demand is concerned, we just use AD, right? There is no difference between the short run and long run, okay? But as far as supply goes, we have short run aggregate supply, which is upward sloping, okay? And we'll talk about it a few minutes later, but long run supply, aggregate supply is just a vertical line, okay? So I'll explain it later, but you know, this short run aggregate supply is upward sloping, just like regular supply curve, okay? If you remember, we explained those slopes in this way, right? For example, why does the demand curve slopes downward? You know, demand curve sloping downward means simply what? There's an inverse relationship between the price and quantity. When the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, vice versa, right? And if you remember, we explained that using the concept of substitution, right? Substitution, right? Because consumers have so many things, so many different things to consume, right? To derive the satisfaction, right? In order to maximize their satisfaction with the given amount of budget, right? When the price of something becomes higher, if something becomes more expensive, right? They tend to choose a little bit cheaper one because what? At lower price you can consume a little more quantity, right? So you know, when the price of something goes up, then the quantity demanded for that particular item tends to go down because consumers substitute something cheaper for that more expensive good, right? You remember the substitution effect and income effect, something we talked about it? Right? Well, that was the initial explanation. And then a little bit later, I gave you a little more detailed and more accurate explanation for this slope of the aggregate demand. I'm sorry, the demand curve. Right? That was what? Marginal utility of A divided by price of A equals marginal utility B divided by price of B. Right? And if you remember, this is the what? The utility maximizing condition for any consumer, right? Because this one, we're comparing the satisfaction to the price level, the price of that item, right? So this is basically what? The amount of satisfaction you receive per dollar, right? Per dollar you spend, right? Okay? So, in case, let's say, they are not equal, then there is a way to improve the situation. In other words, you can increase the total satisfaction you receive, right, by adjusting your consumption behavior, right? What this means is if you spend $1, same $1 on A, you get less amount of satisfaction compared to the case where you spend the same $1 on B, right? So right now, if you spend $1 on B, you get larger amount of satisfaction than in this case, right? So what you need to do is you need to reduce the consumption of A, and then instead you increase the consumption of B, right? That way you can increase your total satisfaction, right? Suppose this is 5 and this is 7, right? And that means if you spend $1 less, right? If you spend $1 less on A, you lose 5 utils of satisfaction. Your total satisfaction goes down by 5 units, right? But if you spend that dollar you save from this side on this side, right? Then you receive 7 utils of additional satisfaction, right? So that means while spending the same amount of money, total amount of money, same total amount of money, your total satisfaction will increase by 2 units, right? If you switch from A to B, right? So the conclusion was, if the price of A, suppose initially they were equal, right? You were in equilibrium, right? But let's say B is on sale this week. Let's say this weekend the bar across the campus has a sale on beer, right? Let's say B is beer, right? Then price of beer goes down, right? Price of beer goes down, right? Then the equilibrium breaks because B is lower now, right? This side is greater than this side, right? So that means you will have to consume more, yeah, beer, right? Increase the consumption of B and reduce the consumption of A, right? In order to maximize your utility, right? So that's the idea, right? If the price of something goes down, the quantity demanded would increase, right? So that's the explanation for this downward sloping demand curve. Right? Remember? Okay? Good. Aggregate demand. As far as aggregate demand curve is concerned, unfortunately, we cannot apply those explanations. Right? Why not? Why can't we use the same explanation for this downward sloping aggregate demand curve?
Because we use price level instead of individual.
In other words, we're talking about aggregate demand. In other words, overall demand. We're not talking about A or B. So there is no substitution, right? In aggregate demand, there is no substitution possible, right? We're not talking about choice between A and B, right? We're talking about the demand for everything, right? So these things, the substitution effect or choice between A and B cannot explain this downward sloping demand, aggregate demand, right? All right, so what are the reasons for this, the slope of aggregate demand? Well, there are 3 effects we can talk about. The first one is the wealth effect. As far as consumption goes, right? Every household has certain amount of income, right? And if the price level goes up, in other words, in general, everything becomes more expensive, right? That amounts to lower wealth or lower purchasing power for the given amount of income that each household is making. In fact, today is payday, right? Does anybody get paid today? 25th is the, I believe, the payday for most Korean, South Korean, right? Including myself, right? Do I look a little happier today? Yeah? All right. So, household has a certain amount of income, but if price level rises, then in relative sense, with the same amount of income, the purchasing power goes down, right? The total amount of actual real goods and services you can buy with the same amount of money declines, right? So the wealth effect means, higher price level makes everybody relatively poor, right? So the demand for consumption will go down, right? The amount of goods and services that households can demand or households can afford, right, will decrease. That's the first reason. The second reason is the interest rate. Okay? When the price level increases, the amount of money that businesses need to borrow to make investment will increase, right? You know, businesses need, suppose they need to borrow money to purchase, say, truck, cargo truck, or equipment, or what, you know, they need to install a new assembly line, right? But if everything becomes more expensive, that means they need to borrow a little more money, right? So think about the money market or the market for loan over fund. We talked about this last class, right? With interest rate and say the amount of money or amount of loan over fund, okay? There is the demand for the loan over fund and the supply for the loan over fund. Who are the suppliers of the fund to the money market? Households. Yeah, savers, right? When people save, right? Assume that money comes to this bank or, you know, fund company, right? So the savers are the suppliers of money. Who are the demanders? Companies, yeah, firms, right? When they borrow money, right, to make investment, right? All right. So if price level rises, the amount of money that the businesses need to borrow will increase, right? So demand for the loan over fund increases, right? And what happens? As a result, the interest rate, market interest rate will increase. Okay? If the interest rate rises, here's something that we didn't talk about so far. There is, if you look at the relationship between the interest rate and the amount of investment demand, right? You will see a negative or downward sloping demand for the investment. We talked about it actually last class, right? If the interest rate goes up, then the usual investment project becomes less profitable, right? Because suppose you expect, say, 20% return on your new project, right? If the current interest rate is only 5%, right? Then that means you can expect, well, ignoring all other costs, right? You can expect 15% real return after paying the interest cost, right? But if the interest rate is higher, it becomes, say, 10%, right? Then this project becomes less profitable, right? Well, for this project, you may still borrow money because you still have some, good amount of profit, right? But some investment projects cannot expect a 20% return if you expect only 10% return on a certain project, right? And then if you have to pay 10% interest, right? And that doesn't make any sense, right? You shouldn't take on this project, right? So when the interest rate is low, then a lot of projects will qualify because they will be profitable, right? But as the interest rate rises, relatively few projects, investment projects, will qualify, right? So that's the idea of this. Yeah? When the interest rate is low, the amount of investment demand will be large, okay? But interest rate is high, the amount of investment demand will decrease. Okay? So again, when we started from the price level here, if the price goes up, then the amount of money that the businesses need to borrow, right, increases, right? So demand for loan over fund, demand for money basically, right, increases. And that means interest rate will go up, right? And when the interest rate is higher, investment demand will decrease. Okay? So we have this inverse relationship between the price and investment demand, right? So we have, yeah, second component of the aggregate demand is investment. Right? That explains the downward sloping demand curve, aggregate demand curve. Right? Finally, the international trade effect. Okay? When the domestic price level rises, if everything becomes more expensive in South Korea, for example, right, then South Korean exports become more expensive to foreigners, right? And that means exports will decline. Export from the South Korea will decline, right? On the other hand, the import becomes relatively cheaper, right? If everything becomes more expensive in the South Korea, right? The import, say California wine, right, will feel relatively cheaper, right? In relative sense, right? So the South Korean will buy more foreign goods, right? So net export is exports minus imports. Okay? So when the price increases, exports decrease, imports increase, right? That makes net export what? Decrease, right? So we have an inverse relationship between price and net export, right? So as we've seen just now, these all three effects, right? The wealth effect, interest rate effect, and the foreign trade effect, right? The international trade effect, right? All three effects work in the same direction. If the price goes up, right? Due to all three effects, the aggregate demand will decrease, right? That's what we have here, right? Aggregate demand curve slopes downward, right? Yeah. Just like we did in microeconomics, right? When we first learned the demand and supply, one of the key concepts, one of the very important things that you had to understand was the movement along the curve versus the shift of the curve, right? Right? Okay. So when we say change in demand or increase or decrease in demand, we meant shift of the curve itself, right? Movement along the curve, right? That's not the change in demand. That's the change in what? Change in quantity demanded, right? Caused by change in prices, right? Yeah. So we're going to talk about the same situation here. Certain things, right, cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Okay? And here in this chapter, they talk about the monetary policy and fiscal policy. Seems a little bit premature because we didn't really talk about these economic policies yet, right? These are the topics of later chapter. We might as well talk about these things today. You know? So those are two large categories of economic policies. Economic policies have two large categories. One is monetary policy, the other is fiscal policy. Right? monetary policy has only one tool, okay? That's money supply. When you think about the money market, okay? Well, this was the market for the loan over fund, okay? The amount of money supplied by the people and the money borrowed by the companies, right? In the later chapters, when we talk about the monetary policy, we're gonna think this way. Yeah? Well, we have interest rate, which is the price of money, because when you borrow money, you have to pay interest, right? And here's the quantity of money. Okay? The demand for money is downward sloping, as we've talked about already. Eh? But supply of money actually is vertical. Okay? Why is it vertical? First of all, what does that mean? If you have vertical curve, right? That means supply of money is not related to the interest rate. Okay? When we talked about the supply for loan over fund, we talked about the upward sloping supply curve, which means, well, if the bank pays higher interest, right, then the households will save more, right, because they can get the higher interest on their money. If the interest rate is low, then the amount of money that the households will save will be smaller, right, which is true, right? But when we talk about the total money supply in the entire economy, right, it is vertical, which means it is unrelated to interest rate because it is controlled by the central authority. By central authority, I mean central bank. Right? In most of the economies, the money supply is controlled by central bank. Okay? Bank of Korea is a central bank in Korea, South Korea. Bank of Japan is the central bank in Japan. Bundesbank is the central bank in Germany. Right? In the United States, they call it Federal Reserve System. Right? Federal Reserve System is the central bank, right? Because they control the money supply. Right? So regardless of the interest rate, right, this money supply is controlled. Right? So central bank, if they want, they can increase the money supply or decrease the money supply, right? Depending on their purpose. Right? If they increase the money supply, what happens? What's the consequence of larger money supply? What do you see? If the money supply is increased, what's going to happen in the money market? Right, interest rate will be lowered, right? We'll have lower interest rate. If you reduce the money supply, of course, interest rate will increase, right? Well, if you increase the money supply, right, then the interest rate comes down. And if the interest rate comes down, what do you see here? What's the result of lower interest rate? No, we're not talking about saving here. Investment. Okay? Investment will increase, right? So out of this, remember this is AD, right? out of total aggregate demand, right? Investment will increase, right? So let's say from the initial situation, let's say currently we are in equilibrium here. Again, equilibrium doesn't mean it's perfect or it's good or whatever, balanced, right? The only meaning of equilibrium is what? What does equilibrium mean? No change, right? So what this means is economy will come to this level of income and output, and it will stay there. It's not going to change, right? The trouble is that equilibrium income level may be substantially lower than the potential GDP, right? We talked about potential GDP, right? In other words, potential GDP level may be here, potential output, right? What is the concept of potential GDP?
When the unemployment rate is natural.
Okay, good. Unemployment rate is at the natural rate. Okay, so what is the natural rate then? What do we mean by natural rate of unemployment? When do we achieve or when do we have natural rate of unemployment?
When there's
There's no cyclical unemployment, right? And as far as employment goes, what do we say? If there is no cyclical unemployment, we say we have achieved full employment, right? So potential GDP is the level of GDP that we can achieve if we achieve the full employment. In other words, all the resources are employed, fully employed, right? But remember, full employment doesn't mean 0% unemployment rate, right? It means 0% cyclical unemployment. There is no cyclical unemployment, right? But there are still the frictional and structural unemployment, right? Anyway, so potential GDP means this is the level of GDP we could have achieved if the economy is running at full employment, okay? But unfortunately, current level of GDP can be significantly lower than potential GDP, right? So what do we call this difference? Difference between the potential GDP and actual GDP. What do you call that? I have enough time today, so I can wait for your answer. Yeah. Yeah. The gap between potential GDP and actual GDP. Remember? I gave all the answers here, right? Simply called the GDP gap, right? GDP gap, right? Gap between the potential and actual, right? So we have substantial GDP gap. What does that mean as far as unemployment goes or employment goes? Right? When we have large GDP gap, that means what?
Large unemployment.
Yeah, there is a significant level of unemployment, right? A lot of people are unemployed, right? Which is not good, right? So in this situation, if this is the situation, then the policy, economic policy should be what? We have to close the gap or reduce the gap. In other words, we need to increase the income level towards the potential income. We need to somehow strengthen the economic activity, right? Because we are in a recession, obviously, right? So we need to get the economy out of the recession, right? How can we do that? What do you think? How can we do that? We can try to shift or increase aggregate demand, right? If we can successfully increase the aggregate demand, right, then the economy will move from this to this equilibrium, right? And as a result, the income level will increase to potential income, potential GDP, right? And the unemployment will decrease, right? So that should be the goal of the economic policy. So as far as monetary policies go, how can we achieve that? Well, you can increase the money supply, just like we saw here. If you increase the money supply, the interest rate will decrease in the economy, which means the companies can borrow the money at lower interest rate, right? So the demand for investment will increase, and if the demand for investment increases, aggregate demand will increase, right? So aggregate demand will shift to the right, okay? And we're going to achieve this goal, right? Of course, it's not all good, right? I mean, there is a cost, right? Because if you do that, the price level will rise. Okay? So I told you already that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, right? If you try to reduce unemployment, you tend to increase inflation, vice versa, right? So that's the trick, right? That's the trick in the economic policy making. You have to strike the delicate balance between the inflation and unemployment, right? Depending on the situation, right? All right, so that's the monetary policy. I guess basically we're covering 2 chapters, and there's later, and separate chapter is on the monetary policy. But let me just add one more thing. The monetary policy is responsibility of the central bank. It's not the responsibility of the government. Okay? When we say government, right, we are talking about the administrative branch, right? The head of the government is, of course, the president, right? President has the final authority in what the government does, right? But president should not have any authority as far as monetary policy goes. Okay? The government has the other type of tool, or the economic policy. It's called the fiscal policy. Okay? And the tool of the fiscal policy tools are taxes and government spending, right? And by changing the tax and government spending, government can increase or decrease aggregate demand, right? And they should be able to achieve the same goal, right? Well, that's the next slide here. Fiscal policy. Okay? So let's say we are in the same situation. Suppose current GDP is significantly lower than the potential GDP, which means the economy is in a recession, right? And let's say government wants to bring the economy out of the recession, right? What can they do? Well, they can cut the taxes and or increase the spending, right? What happens if you cut the taxes? Well, if you lower the taxes, first of all, the households will have more money left in their pocket, in their account to consume, right? So they can spend more on consumption, right? So the consumption demand will increase, right? If government lowers the tax rate on corporations, right? then the businesses will have more money to invest, right? So the investment will increase, right? And if the government increases the spending, the purchase on goods and services, right? Then certainly the government spending will increase. Okay? So any one of those, right? The reduction in taxes or increase in purchase, government purchase, right? That will increase aggregate demand. Okay? So we call that expansionary policy. Expansionary fiscal policy will involve lowering taxes and increasing the spending, and that means aggregate demand will shift to the right, right? And as a result, the GDP will increase, employment will increase, income will increase, right? Economy will get stronger and out of the recession, or at least increase, right? So that's the fiscal policy tool. Okay? Sometimes government uses contractionary fiscal policy, which means the opposite, right? Increasing taxes, reducing the government spending, right? It's called the contractionary fiscal policy tool, right? If that happens, of course, the consumption demand will decrease, investment demand will decrease, and the G will also decrease, right? So aggregate demand will shift to the left or decrease, right? And the consequence will be income will be lower, right? And unemployment rate will be higher. Why would the government want to do that? Why would the government want to make the economy weaker and reduce the output and income and increase unemployment? Right? Any idea? Look at the graph. What happens?
Price level.
Yes, price level will be lower. Something like that, let's say. Okay? So, well, the only reason why the government would possibly use contractionary fiscal policy is if they think the current inflation is too high, right? If the inflation is too high, then the economy is in danger, right? Inflation is not good, right? Because inflation makes the long-term contract impossible, right? Because people don't know what's going to happen to the price level next year or a few years later, right? So they will be reluctant to engage in long-term commitment, right? And in business, everything is a contract, right? The employment contract, supply contract, or whatever, right? So the high inflation is not good for the economy, right? So what's best is the stable price level, right? That's what the economic policies are trying to achieve, right? So if the government considers the current inflation is too high, right, then they would use contractionary fiscal policy, try to reduce the aggregate demand and slow down the inflation, and so on, right? That's the idea. Right? There's a contractionary monetary policy, of course, right? If the money supply is reduced, if the Federal Reserve or Bank of Korea reduces the money supply, right? Then of course, well, if the money supply is reduced, then the interest rate will rise, right? If the interest rate rises, what happens? The investment demand will decrease, right? And if the investment demand decreases, aggregate demand decreases, right? The same thing will happen, right, in the economy, right? So I was going to mention these two policy authorities are supposed to be completely separate, right, for checks and balance, right? So the monetary policy is a responsibility of central bank. Okay? So the head of the central bank, I guess the president of the Bank of Korea, what's his name, Lee right now. Okay? He has the final authority in the monetary policy in South Korea. Right? The president should not have any influence on the monetary policy. Right? And as far as fiscal policy goes, right, the president has the final authority, right? So these two policies should be completely separate, right? In the United States, the Federal Reserve System has, of course, full control of the monetary policy, and the final decision is made by the 7-member Board of Governors, right? In the Board of Governors is the highest decision-making body in the Federal Reserve System, right? And once you are appointed to to that board, 7-member board, right? Each member is guaranteed 14-year term. The term is 14 years, right? Once you are appointed, right? So think about it. You know, that's the very responsible, very important position, right? Basically, depending on what Federal Reserve System does, and actually what the 7-member Board of Governors decides, right? Entire world's economy will follow, right? What the U.S. does in its interest rate, right, affects basically all the economy, especially the South Korean economy will be very severely impacted by what the Federal Reserve System does in the U.S. Right? So in order to be appointed to this 7-member board, you probably have to be in your 50s, right? You have to have a lot of experience in banking, probably, and also you have to know a lot about the economics, yeah, and so on, right? And once you are appointed, you have 14-year term. That means you're basically until you retire, right? You don't have to worry about your job. Okay? Why are they allowed such a long term? To eliminate any possibility of influence, outside influence. Okay? So you don't have to worry about anybody, even the president, right? President cannot touch you, right? So you have to have your own independence based on your own analysis. You have to, cast your vote in making the decision, right? So that's the idea of the independence between the monetary policy and fiscal policy. Okay? All right. So here we talk about a few cases. The government purchase increases, the aggregate demand increases, of course, right? Then you know what happens. If the aggregate demand increases, income and output will increase, employment will increase, right? And that's what we call the expansionary policy, right? If the personal income tax and business taxes are increased, that's contractionary policy, right? Because tax is a leakage from the system, right? From the circulation. If tax increases, then you're sucking some money out of the circulation, right? So that will have negative impact on the economy, right? So the aggregate demand will shift to the left, right? Which means output and income and employment will all decrease. Unemployment will increase, right? So the only, again, case you will use the contractionary policy will be if you have too much inflation, right? If controlling inflation is your goal, then you would use negative or contractionary policy. Yep. All right, expectation can affect or shift aggregate demand. Right? If people in general have optimistic view of the future, if they expect better economy or stronger economy in the future, right? Then, well, first of all, the businesses will invest more, right? If businesses think that next year will be a better year, a stronger economy, which means the demand for their product will increase, right? Then they will invest today to build another assembly line or start a new project, right? To be prepared for the next year when the demand for their product is stronger, right? So investment demand will increase and aggregate demand will increase. If households have optimistic view for the future, right? Then they'll probably save less, right? Instead of saving, they'll probably consume, right? Because they don't have to worry about job security next year, right? So that will increase the aggregate demand and make the economy stronger, right? So here, somewhere, this expectation tends to bring the self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay? In macroeconomics, a very, very interesting phenomenon, right? It's called the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Or self-realizing prophecy. Right? That means if people think the economy is going to improve, right, then even if there was absolutely no reason for the improvement, the economy will get better just because people expect it that way. Just like here, right? If people think, next year the economy will be better, right, then they will consume more today, right? Which means aggregate demand will increase and actually economy will improve just because people thought, right? If people think economy will be worse next year, if people, are afraid of the future, right, then they will reduce their consumption, increase the saving, right? That means aggregate demand will shift back and economy will actually shrink, right? Just because people thought, right? It's called the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So that's why, if you listen to these politicians, like, president, right? They always say, don't worry, everything's going to be fine, right? Yeah? It's not going to be as bad as you think, So it's actually their job, right? Of course, politicians are liars. They always lie and cheat, right? But partly that's their job, right? If the president appears on TV and says, "Oh, we are in trouble," the economy is going down, right? Then the economy will be in big trouble, right? Really, just because the president said that, right? It's going to increase the insecurity, right? And people will try to save money, right? And that's going to, make the economy weaker, right? All right, so the foreign income if the foreign incomes rise more slowly than ours, that means if the economy in this country, domestic economy, is stronger than the foreign economy, right? Then the imports of our good will fall. In other words, our export will decrease, right? And our import will increase. This is a very interesting phenomenon in international trade, right? So in the next course, I mean, when you take actual economics, you'll learn the detail about the international trade. Yeah? And this is one idea why we believe free trade is good. Right? Free trade without any barrier, trade barrier or control, right? We should just have free trade, right? If you have free trade, when there is imbalance across country, right? Thanks to the trade, there will be some forces that will work towards the rebalance of the economy, right? So think about it. Right now, the situation this paragraph is talking about is this country is doing better than other country, right? Then what's going to happen is the export of this country will decrease naturally, and import of this country from other country will increase, right? So that means net export will decrease if the economy of this country is stronger than other country. And everything is relative. That means in other countries, their net export will increase, which means their aggregate demand will increase, right? So that will work towards improving their economy, right? And in this country, because net export is going down, right? Aggregate demand will go down, right? So the difference or gap between this country will be narrowed, right? Automatically. You can say it's kind of an automatic stabilizer, right? Automatic equalizer, right? Across countries, I mean, different nations, right? If our exchange rate rises, yeah. So exchange rate is another factor that will affect the aggregate demand, right? So, you know, suppose let's say there's a California wine, okay, and the price is $10 per bottle. And the exchange rate was, say, 1,100 Korean wons per US dollar. Okay? And that means for Korean people, if you want to buy a bottle of California wine, right, you would pay what, 11,000 won, right? But if the exchange rate goes up, right? So let's say US dollar becomes stronger, right? So in order to buy $1 US, now you have to pay 1,200 won per US dollar. Okay? And that means even if there was no change in the price of wine, this California wine, right? If the Korean people want to buy this or import a bottle of California wine, you have to pay what? 12,000 won, right? So the import becomes more expensive, or from the U.S. point of view, right? If the U.S. dollar becomes stronger, what we call appreciation, if the U.S. dollar appreciates, then the export from U.S. becomes more expensive to foreigners, right? So export of U.S. will decrease, right? And in relative sense, the export from South Korea will be cheaper for Americans, right? when Americans try to buy something from the South Korea, right? They can pay less dollar, right, to buy the export from Korea, right? So what does that do to net export, right? For the United States, if dollar appreciates, net export will decrease, right? And aggregate demand will decrease, right? For Korea, South Korea, right? When the US dollar appreciates, that means South Korean won depreciates, South Korean won becomes weaker, and that will increase the net export and increase the aggregate demand. Okay? So again, the exchange rate sort of works as a balancer, right? Balancing force. Right? When there is kind of imbalance between two nations, right? The free trade, the international trade, will have some forces, right? Natural forces that will rebalance the economies, right? So that's the idea of the free trade, right? All right. Any questions so far? Okay. So as I said, after this chapter, you will have pretty good idea about, you know, how the economy works, right? National economy works, okay? And even, you know, we're talking about the policies as well. Right? Okay, so we're gonna finish this chapter on Tuesday. Make sure you work on the homework over the weekend, because you can go back to the festival and continue drinking at this point, I guess. Have a good weekend.